And
And
Dun.
Steve Vaughan, who was the Director of Social Services.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to meet so many people from the deaf community all in one place. I would have liked to spend more of the day with you. Unfortunately, after my presentation, I've got to go to a wedding in London for this afternoon. I've left copies of the presentation, and I've also left copies of DVDs. You're each welcome to take a DVD, and I hope that Richard will circulate DVDs to other deaf clubs around Wales. I work for the Welsh Assembly Government, and I work in social services within the Welsh Assembly Government. And I want to introduce a series of consultations on services to the deaf community, to deaf people. And in many respects, I'm afraid today I'm starting off with probably the dullest subject, but one which I think is still important. And what I wanted to talk to you today about was the registration process, where we register people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now, local authorities have a responsibility to register people who are deaf and hard of hearing. But in a study that we conducted recently, we found the systems to be very inconsistent, very unreliable, and far from accurate. They tend to be, the system for registering people who are blind tends to be much more accurate. The one exception is when we're dealing with newborn children, where because of the screening process, we are now able to pick up and establish who deaf children are very, very quickly. So up to the age of 10, there are very good records of who the deaf children are, but for adults, our systems are unreliable. So that poses a question really. If the system is unreliable, why do we carry on doing it? And before we abandon the system, I think many of us felt that we should try and make the system of registration work to see if we can improve it so that it would achieve real benefits for the deaf community and for people who are hard of hearing, and as well as actually for the people who are trying to provide services. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Now, under the current system, when people are registered as deaf or hard of hearing, there are certain categories. And these are deaf without speech, deaf with speech, hard of hearing. And I think many people felt that those categories are well out of date. And in fact, if you go back to the legislation, it talks about people being deaf, dumb or blind. It's not very nice language in terms of the present day, and it's perhaps not as relevant. So the recommendations we would like to make is that we have one consistent system for registration throughout Wales. That it would make no difference in which local authority you live, the system will be the same throughout Wales. The second recommendation is that we would like to improve the accuracy of registration, and it is what we would like to do is to make give the responsibility to the local health boards for the initial registration, because that is going to be the first point of contact with this recognition that somebody has got a serious hearing impairment. So we think it would be much more accurate if it started with the health service, as is the system with people who are blind, for example. Okay? Another recommendation that we would like to pursue is the information that the local health board will collect. Right. So we would like that local health board, when they're registering people, obviously they need to collect the name, date of birth, address, contact details, the ethnic origin of the individual. They would need to record the GP and audiologist, any hearing aids provided. Are there any additional needs? Because of course there will be some people who will have a range of needs, and they may have a visual impairment, a learning disability. We would want them to record that. And then we would like them to record the deafness categories and the preferred means of communication. I think it's very important that organisations know what the preferred mean of communication is. And the degree of hearing loss. We would like them to record the degree of hearing loss. So that would be a recommendation in its own right. I don't think that's overburdensome in terms of the information they would collect. We would suggest that the categories of registration are changed, and that the following categories would be adopted. So the first category would be deaf people, those whose main or preferred communication is British Sign Language. They have distinctive communication needs and need communication support, accessible information and assistive equipment. This group is part of the deaf community. Yeah? So that would be the first time that BSL users, the deaf community, would be recognised in its own right in that sense. The second category would be people who have spoken language, use hearing aids, lip reading, and require assistive technology for social inclusion. But these people are not part of the deaf community. And the third category is the people who are deaf but never learned BSL. These are people who are deaf but were never afforded the opportunity to learn BSL, and whose ability to communicate and benefit from education and learning has been severely impaired. Now, I think that third category is important because, as I understand it, in the past there's been lots of battles sometimes between education and social services about whether people should be encouraged to use BSL, or whether there's just an emphasis on them using their any residual hearing. But I think that that's left probably a group of people who have been held back because they weren't afforded the opportunity to learn BSL as young people. Probably their language has been impaired and they've suffered the consequences. Another recommendation that we would like to make is obviously that the deaf and hard of hearing people should be consulted on all recommendations concerning changes in the registration process. Now all this may seem rather dull because we're talking about categories and whatever, and I hope that's not insulting to anybody here. But the only point of registering is that if we're going to have improved benefits for the deaf community and for people with hard of hearing, if we're not going to try and get additional